In the previous video, we talked about the Cournot oligopoly. In the Cournot oligopoly, we have two essentially identical firms. They compete in the same market, have the same total cost function, so we can write their profit functions. We can find a best response for each firm, like we did here. And then we said that the non-cooperative outcome is if we have two best response functions listed here, they are producing these quantities simultaneously and independently. So it boils down to essentially just plugging in one for the other, which is what I've done here. QA equals 500 minus 1/2 QB. And we know what QB is if firm B is producing their profit max level. All right, so we can just do a little bit of math. Right, half of 500, then we've got the negative times the negative, so this is positive, and then we rearrange and find our quantity. Right, we can plug back into the best response function up here. Now that we know QA and find QB, we can find the market price. We can find profit for each firm. Price times quantity minus the total cost of producing that. So in this video, we're going to talk about the cooperative outcome, which we call cartel behavior. What we know is that the market structure, which in general is profit maximizing to the producer and minimizes consumer surplus, is a monopoly. So we ask the question here, how would a monopolist behave? All right, market demand is still 1200 minus Q, where Q is the market quantity. And now the monopolist is the only producer in the market, so that Q is the monopolist quantity. Still keep the same total cost function, 200Q. And we know that the monopolist will choose the quantity where MC equals MR. Right, so what's MC here? Derivative of total cost with respect to Q, or 200. And then we know that marginal revenue for the monopolist is the same thing as market demand, except with twice the slope. So 1200 minus 2Q. And of course, you could find total revenue by multiplying this here by Q and taking the derivative, you'd get the same thing. All right, so we're just rearranging here. We get 2Q equals 1000 or Q star equals 500. We can plug back into our market demand to get a price of 700 for that quantity. And then we find our profits, price times quantity minus the total cost of producing that quantity. Right, we can see in the monopoly, the profits are 250,000. Compare that to 111,000 each for two firms, or about 222,000. So the monopolist profits are higher. And what we're saying here is that the two firms could collude and agree to limit their quantity to 250 each, or 500 total, the monopoly quantity, in order to produce monopoly quantity at the monopoly price. And if they were splitting it evenly, they would each make profits of 125,000 instead of 111,000. All right, and we could do like the consumer surplus calculation to show that this is also worse for the consumers, but we can see that there's a lower quantity and a higher price, 500 and 700 versus 667 and a price of 533. All right, so the monopolist produces, even compared to the duopoly, a lower quantity and charges a higher price. That's good for producers, not so much for consumers. Okay, I actually haven't shown the consumer surplus here, but you know how to calculate it. We have our market demand, we have a quantity and a price, so it's just the triangle area of a formula. All right, so now we want to know, would this agreement be enforceable, or would the competitors actually stick to it? Now we've decided that if they collude and each produce 250, so that they combine to produce the market quantity, their profits would be higher. Well, remember, let's take a look at, we could do the same thing for QB. It doesn't matter which we pick, but let's look at one of the best response functions. We see that if we plug this quantity for the competitor of 250 in, we get 500 minus 125, or 375. Right, so what this is telling us is that the best response function for firm A is telling us that their best response to a quantity of 250 is not to also produce 250 and meet the monopoly quantity. It would be to actually produce 375. Let's show it. If firm A cheats on the agreement and produces 375 in response to B producing 250, then we can calculate the market price. We can calculate A's profit. Right? Market price is 575, and A has cheated on this agreement and produced a higher quantity, minus the total costs of producing that quantity. B, meanwhile, is sticking to the agreement, producing 250. Right, so they market price times quantity minus the total cost of producing 250. And what we can see is that A actually earns higher profit yet by cheating on this agreement at the expense of B. All right, so the moral of this story is that cheating on this agreement is profit maximizing. And so if this was a one-shot deal, the agreement might not be enforceable. Each firm, again, we could flip it and do B and A. Each firm would have an incentive to produce more than the agreed upon amount and make profit at expense of the other. The way that this could be enforceable is if the two companies are competing over time. So you have some sort of like reputation effects, or there might be relationships between company management. All right, so to this point, we've done the Cournot duopoly. We showed what would happen if the duopolists act independently, simultaneously and independently. And then we showed what could happen if they were able to collude. In the next videos, we'll talk about quantity and price leadership. Right? We'll show that firms actually have some incentive to be the first in the market choosing their quantity, or maybe to be the first in the market producing a product. And then we'll also talk about what happens if the companies actually compete in prices rather than choosing in quantities.